World War II. Coming just 2 decades after the last great global war, the Second World War was the most widespread and deadliest war in human history, involving more than 30 countries and resulting in more than 50 million military and civilian deaths, with some estimates as high as 85 million dead, sparked by Adolf Hitler's invasion of Poland in 1939. The war would drag on for 6 deadly years until the final Allied defeat of both Nazi Germany and Japan in 1945. After the German conquest of Poland in September 1939, Hitler turned his attention to the West. His ultimate goal was to invade the Soviet Union, but he knew the defeat of the Western European nations was a necessity to avoid a two-front war. The first step was to invade the Low Countries, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium, and France. Hypothetically, Germany could then conquer Britain, redeploy to the east, and fight a one-front war against the Russians. The German army was actually outnumbered by the Allies. However, the numbers game didn't matter because the German plan was so effective. Once the Germans invaded the Low Countries, the French Army and British Expeditionary Force, or BEF for short, moved north to face the Germans head-on. This allowed German Army Group A to cut through the Allied defenses in the Ardennes and advance towards the English Channel, effectively trapping them with their backs against the sea. A new offensive was launched against Paris, France fell, and the BEF was executed at Dunkirk. The country was divided into German occupation zones and Vichy France. Germany was then free to focus on knocking Britain out of the war. Hitler's objective in invading the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, was always Moscow. This capital city was considered to be extremely important militarily and politically. The original Axis plan was to capture Moscow within 4 months after the start of the invasion of the USSR. The Axis wished to take the capital before the onset of winter. Autumn rains and stiffened resistance slowed the Germans, but by December they were less than 19 miles from Moscow. The exhausted Red Army was saved by a terrible Russian winter. The fresh troops from Siberia, which were trained for winter warfare, temperatures dropped as low as 50 below zero. German troops had no winter clothing, and the panzers were not designed to operate in such low temperatures. On the 5th of December 1941, the Russians counterattacked and pushed the German army back. For the first time, the Germans retreated on a large scale. Operation Barbarossa had failed. Hitler now faced a war of attrition, something that he was bound to lose. The Germans sustained around 400,000 casualties. More importantly, Hitler took personal charge of the military and set the most experienced German officers against him. Hitler's distrust of his senior officers reduced the German advantage of superior military leadership. The Soviets did launch offensive the following spring, but this did little more than set the stage for the Battle of Stalingrad, a battle which they would win. The Battle of Stalingrad was the midway of the Eastern Front. The battle was a disaster for Germany and made victory in the East virtually impossible. After the Red Army had prevailed at Moscow, the Eastern Front had stabilized in line running from Leningrad to Rostov near the Black Sea. Hitler was confident that he could defeat the Red Army when the weather was no longer an issue. The capture of Stalingrad was important because it was a vital transportation route between the Caspian Sea and northern Russia, and was the gateway to the rich oil Caucasus region. Its capture would also be an ideological victory due to the fact that Stalingrad bore the name of Joseph Stalin. The battle began with the Luftwaffe reducing the city to rubble and rendering the river Volga, vitally important for bringing supplies into the city, unusable. By the end of August, the Germans had reached Stalingrad. The Soviets tried to keep their front lines as close to the Germans as possible. This hugging tactic in an urban environment negated the German doctrine, which relied on close cooperation between infantry, tanks, engineers, artillery, and aircraft. German infantry units were forced to fight on their own, or risk taking casualties from their own supporting fire. The Soviets were able to hold on to the city until winter. At certain points in the battle, the Germans held 90% of the city, but the Red Army counterattacked in November and were able to encircle 300,000 Axis troops. The Germans sustained 841,000 casualties and would only launch one more offensive at Kursk, which would end up being another disastrous defeat. The Battle of Kursk took place after the Battle of Stalingrad and was the final offensive the Germans were able to launch in the east. The Germans envisioned breaking through the northern and southern flanks to encircle the Soviet forces. However, the Soviets knew Hitler's intentions and constructed a series of defenses. The Germans delayed the attack to wait for new Tiger and Panther tanks, giving the Red Army even more time to dig in and gather forces for a counterattack. To give some perspective, the defensive networks around Kursk were 10 times deeper than the Magnet Line. The main German attack on the 5th of July. Due to the depth of the Russian defenses, the German Blitzkrieg was stopped. This was the first time the Blitzkrieg offensive had been defeated before it could break through enemy defenses and into its strategic depths. After the failed attack, the Red Army counterattacked. The Germans would be on the defensive for the rest of the war in the east. The war in Europe would last for 2 more years, but in the time the Battle of Kursk was over, the Americans and British were on the verge of invading Italy. The Red Army was on the offensive, and the Allies were producing more war materials than the Germans. At Kursk alone, the Germans lost 720 tanks, 680 aircraft, and sustained 170,000 casualties. The battle was the largest tank battle in history, and the Germans paid dearly. By the end of 1943, they were being pushed back across a broad front in the east, and faced the possibility of a second front in the west. After 3 years of war, the Allies finally had the strategic advantage. If the United Kingdom was knocked out of the war, Hitler could have focused all of Germany's military might on the Soviet Union. The Americans and Soviets would have to fight the Axis alone, and the British Isles could not have been used as a staging point for Operation Overlord. The British Expeditionary Force was, for the most part, successfully executed at Dunkirk, following the Battle of France. However, most of their equipment was left in France. At the beginning of the Battle of Britain, the only fully equipped division in England was Canadian. If Germany achieved air superiority over the skies of Britain, they could have launched Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of the British Isles. The Royal Navy would have been ineffective in stopping the invasion without air cover. The initial Luftwaffe strategy was to destroy the Royal Air Force bases. This worked quite well until the strategy changed to bombing towns and cities. This gave the RAF a chance to replace its lost aircraft. Radar was essential. Without it, the RAF would have to keep planes in the air at all times. They lacked the resources to do this. Radar allowed fighters to wait on the ground and coordinate attacks on the German bomber formations. By October of 1940, the Luftwaffe was running low on air crews and aircraft. German air supremacy was not achieved, and Hitler postponed Sea Lion indefinitely. The end of the battle allowed Britain to rebuild its military and establish itself as an Allied stronghold. Winston Churchill summed the battle with the words, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." These were just a few of the battles that took place during World War II.